Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Democracy That Delivers podcast. I'll be your host today. I'm Jenny Anderson, Senior Program Officer with the Asia team here at CIPE. Today's podcast is the final episode of CIPE's Philippine National Elections, What's at Stake for Democracy series. For our listeners, a quick background. On May 9th, the Philippines held elections, and the son of the dictator, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., was elected president with the first absolute majority in recent Philippine history. This is a remarkable comeback for the Marcoses. The family history has been completely rehabilitated from one of dictatorship, kleptocracy, and human rights abuse to a golden age of prosperity and unity. Marcos Jr. was sworn in on June 30th as the 17th president of the Philippines. During his inauguration speech, he praised his father's legacy and pledged to confront an array of challenges as President Rodrigo Duterte concluded his 6-year term. Mr. Marcos has presented himself as a leader who will help the Philippines improve its economy and secure a more prosperous future. Today, we'll be discussing exactly that: the outlook for the Philippines, the economy, the new administrations, indicators to look for, both positive and negative. For this final podcast series, in this series, we have the pleasure of being joined by a special guest, Dr. Francisco Magno, who joins us from Manila. Dr. Magno is a professor of political science at De La Salle University in Manila, as well as a research fellow at the university's Robredos Institute of Governance. Dr. Magno has authored numerous books and articles, including a chapter in a new book titled Beyond Crisis, A Strategic Agenda for the Next President, which I hope we can talk more about today during the podcast. Dr. Magno, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Jenny.
Thank you. We are also joined by my excellent co-host, Bea Baldonaro. Bea is a program officer based at CIPE's Asia Regional Office in Manila. Thanks for joining us today, Bea.
Thank you too, Jenny. It's great to be back in the podcast and to be doing the last episode of our mini-series. So thank you, and I look forward to discussion today.
Great, likewise. So to kick off our conversation, Dr. Magno, in your very knowledgeable assessment, what should be the governance agenda for the newly elected President Marcos Jr.?
Of course, let's go back to the election campaign. It's a very interesting election because you have a front runner who in the surveys never relinquished the lead, and in fact kept a huge lead in the surveys leading to the election. And it's probably because of that the quality of the election campaign suffered, in the sense that the Philippines did not have these competitive vigorous debates that would have allowed the voters to make their intelligent choices based on the platform and campaign program of the candidates. And the leading candidate, who is now President Marcos, Filipinos had a hard time really putting real programs behind him. And so we are now observing very keenly what the next steps are taken by the new government. But having said that, we have to recognize that the new government was elected by a majority vote, considering that the Philippines has a multi-sided pluralistic system, which means it's not a one-on-one contest. You have multiple candidates. And very interestingly, it's the first time in the post-EDSA, or what we call post-dictatorship era, that we now have a majority president. And so there is a lot of expectation, therefore, for a majority president to carry on the burden of representing the Filipino citizens. Thank you, Jenny, for mentioning the book and the chapter that I contributed to that book. And what I presented there is a governance agenda, basically using the indicators provided by the World Bank. It's the World Governance Indicators, or WGI, which is an index of indicators, including rule of law, voice and accountability, government effectiveness, controlling corruption, regulatory quality, and political stability. So there's a lot in there. But the nice thing is these are the same indicators that are being used in the key planning document of the Philippine government. And that's the Philippine Development Plan, which is our medium-term development plan that is issued with the entry of a new administration. But what's interesting about this document is that it provides continuity. Even though we change administrations, we change governments every 6 years, this is a document that is sustained. So in a way, it's a tool for accountability. And again, the indicators have been there for several Philippine development plans. And what I saw in the past 5 years, there have been a decline in performance, which means that despite the popularity, it's not seeming, but it's a fact that the Duterte administration finished the term with a very high popularity rating. In fact, it's probably the highest in Philippine political history. Under the 1987 Constitution, it's almost 60% popularity rating. But having said that, it indicates that there is a lot that's playing on in the Philippine political system or Philippine political dynamics, which perhaps is not very much different from what's happening in the world. I would call this the advance of populism, which means that through rhetoric and through the adept, astute, and intelligent use of various media platforms, including online and social media platforms, a political leader can, in fact, show that he or she is performing well, even if the data doesn't support that. And so, what I did in the chapter is I provided what the data reveals, and I try to interpret this data. And it shows that over the vast array of indicators, there has been a decline. For example, Jenny, let me cite a voice and accountability. Although what I did I presented some tables where I compare the Philippines in ASEAN. So, of course, within the ASEAN ecosystem, the Philippines is still doing well. It's second to Indonesia, but even then, you would note that historically the Philippines is really on top of the heap when it comes to democratic practice. But over the years, there has been a decline. And so the Philippines in the voice and accountability set of indicators came in second to Indonesia. Now, what is the reason for this? I would say that in the past administration, there has been a high level of intolerance to a contrary opinion. And there is a lot of framing that if you do not agree with the government, you are being obstructive. You are an obstructionist. So this kind of thinking is very dangerous because there is intolerance to critical thinking, to opposing ideas, which is very undemocratic in that sense. So what we need to really observe clearly here is whether the majority vote that was harvested by the current government will be used to shut down contrary opinion. So that is something that we need to observe. But having said that, it's really therefore very important to reignite the different democratic institutions in the country. And that includes the role of the legislature, the role of civil society, the very important role of independent media and policy think tanks and knowledge-based institutions. That's why I really think that being able to provide data that shows performance will be very important in accountability processes. So, having said these important observations, in the past days where we see the new government in place, we can compare it with the previous administration. In terms, even if we say that there is a continuity in terms of populism, relying a lot on popularity and using a lot of social media platforms, which I think contributes a lot to hyper partisanship. Because if you would notice that when a president is elected in a highly polarized system, there is this practice of maintaining the campaign architecture, which means that your base of supporters that you mobilize during the election campaign, you sustain this. And that means maintaining the so-called social influencers with their own online social media platforms. And so they continue attacking opposition to the administration. So I think that contributes to what I call hyper-partisanship and polarization. And so, in order to combat this dangerous trend of really having only one-sided thinking, it's really very important to engage, not necessarily to just oppose this system, but really engage and contribute information, because there's a lot of disinformation also happening and circulating around. Yeah, maybe I am
Definitely.
doing so much of a monologue, Jenny.
Yeah, no, just to jump in, I want to follow up and ask you about the world governance indicators that you're looking at, but to dig in a bit more about that, you mentioned sort of the run up, the campaign period, as well as the use of social media and disinformation and everything. I mean, the Philippines has been referred to as patient zero by Facebook in the global disinformation epidemic. It's been, I think, referred to as like the proverbial canary in the coal mine by analysts who are tracking the spread of false news and seen as a testing ground for disinformation campaigns. And I mean, on top of that, so many Filipinos are online, like 75% of Filipinos are online, mostly on Facebook and YouTube. And then just thinking about like this election, that so many young people turned out, like the youth vote was really large. I mean, this is sort of diverting from the chapter in your book, but thinking about disinformation and the role, and you said like sort of this new administration is sort of already following in the path of the previous. I don't know, thinking about disinformation and thinking about the role it played in these elections and thinking about democracy in the Philippines. There's something we should all be thinking about as we look at, the state of democracy globally.
Yeah, let me put into context that what the new government is doing. Of course, the first 100 days and the first few days really is about making appointments to various executive positions, since we also have a presidential system. So the president, as the chief executive, has the power of appointment. So that is a good indicator of where the country is going. So the first few appointments made by the president is something that's encouraging, considering that, as I mentioned, the president was able to get a majority vote, and you have a political alliance among political families, political elites that were harnessed. And yet, you can see in the initial appointments, especially the economic team that was set up by the president, are people appointed with what we may call high credibility in the business community. At the same time, you see the appointed officials as coming from various, we may call political colors. For example, the Secretary of Economic Planning, Socio-Economic Planning, was also the Socio-Economic Planning Secretary under the Aquino administration. And that's Secretary Arsenio Balisacan. And then you have the Department of Trade and Industry Secretary, Federico Pascual, who was a former president of the University of the Philippines. As you know, the University of the Philippines is a bastion of liberalism, and some of the rabid supporters of the former president would in fact wanted to abolish the University of the Philippines. So appointing a former president of the University of the Philippines, I think, is quite a choice. And the Secretary of Finance is Benjamin Benjokno, who also came from the University of the Philippines. And of course, he was also the Department of Budget and Management Secretary under President Duterte and under President Estrada. But he also served as Undersecretary of Budget under President Corazon Aquino. So when you look at the economic team, I think the president wanted to show that he would like the business community to be comfortable and to be confident that his administration would follow the rules without favoritism. So that provides a certain level of encouragement. And considering that these appointees came from academe and they came from the University of the Philippines, they were former professors. And so we can see that these are people who would not engage in fake news. And they are economists, and they know the value of data. And the fact that the indicators that I was mentioning, world governance indicators, actually is being used by the National Economic and Development Authority in the Philippine Development Plan. I think that provides a convergence point on resurrecting, in a way, I say resurrecting because with populism, there is a tendency to dismiss real data and to just rely on opinion instead of using hard data. And as we all know, data is very important in democracy.
I was just going to go back, thinking of the evidence-based analysis that you're doing and the recommendations. You mentioned that you're looking at the world governance indicators, and you mentioned how the Philippines ranked in the governance or indicators on government effectiveness. How has the Philippines performed in this assessment?
Yeah, when it comes to government effectiveness, since I located the Philippines within the 10 countries of ASEAN, so the Philippines is in the lower half of the ranking among the ASEAN countries. So actually, it performed better than Vietnam in 2018 and 2019, but dropped back to 17th spot in 2020. And I think a key challenge in the Philippines is really how to improve efforts for interoperability, because there is a tendency for government agencies not to share their data. They have their own databases, so they don't work well together. So there's really need for interoperability. And one of the things that's hampering that is the inability to really use digital platforms, although they're using digital platforms for something else, for campaigning. But what is needed is really using electronic means for improving public services. So that means enhancing the digital readiness of the various agencies. So, Jenny, we passed a law that instituted the Department of Information and Communications Technology, the ICT, in 2016. So it took the previous administration to really put that into place. But unfortunately, it did not really perform well. So I think it's because of the lack of capacity on the part of those who were appointed. But there is hope that the current appointee, the Secretary of the ICT, somebody who has served in that capacity already, knowledgeable about the work of that agency, and it's expected that that agency can provide a lot of support to the other agencies in promoting interoperability among the different agencies. And so there is a need really to improve on government effectiveness. There was a program called the Interagency Business Process Interoperability Program established to facilitate the convergence of government databases. And so the governance delivery program range from co-location, which means an example of that would be the business one-stop shop window. Unlike before that you are asked to go to different agencies, and now there is an effort really with the implementation of the Anti-Red Tape Act and the amendment to that Anti-Red Tape Act, which is the Ease of Doing Business Act, which aims to really to reduce red tape, simplify procedures, and also to really rationalize the bureaucracy.
Yeah, there's so much to dig into there. I mean, thinking about digital transformation as well as how government agencies share data. But unfortunately, we only have about 5 minutes left of our conversation here. And I know you've looked at the ranking, looking at how the Philippines has ranked regarding rule of law, as well as controlling corruption. And I think our listeners would be very interested to hear more about what you're seeing, what data you're looking at when it comes to looking at this sort of the state of rule of law in the Philippines, as well as corruption.
Yeah, when it comes to the rule of law, the Philippines is on a downward spiral since 2016. And the erosion of the rule of law can be attributed to the allegations of extrajudicial killings that hounded the previous administration because of the signature program of the previous administration, which is the drug war. And that campaign was really a major reason for the decline in the rule of law in the Philippines. And another factor is the intolerant attitude of the previous administration to criticism. And that led to legal actions against independent media. And there are still ongoing legal actions, and that's already in the courts. So that's a major reason for the downward spiral in rule of law. But the other thing is the judicial system itself. The court system needs really to modernize. There are a lot of backlogs in cases. It takes a long time for cases to be resolved. But there are efforts, I think, with technical cooperation, even from the United States Bar Council. So there are these types of development cooperation to improve the administration of justice in the country. Your other question is about controlling corruption. So as we noticed during the pandemic period, it became an opportunity for the outbreak of corruption. The health crisis provided an opportunity for corruption to explode, as evidence in the legislative committee hearings. Both the Senate and the House of Representatives conducted hearings on the irregular use of the health budget, irregular procurement proceedings. And in fact, because of these legislative hearings, there are recommendations actually for the ombudsman to prosecute these cases. Although in the case of the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee report, it was not signed by the majority. So it's now up for the Office of the Ombudsman to take up the report because it's not officially signed by the majority of the senators. But what is interesting here is the crucial role of institutional checks in the country. And that is the vital role of institutions like the Commission on Audit, because the Commission on Audit, through their reports, expose the irregularities in procurement proceedings. So controlling corruption in the country in terms of these indicators, we're really on a decline. And it's really important for the new government to address these factors.
The new government has a lot to take into account when addressing sort of the way forward. I think Bea wanted to jump in with a question before we get too far along. Bea, did you have a question to jump in with?
Yeah, just one quick question, actually, Jenny. And thank you again, Dr. Magno, for just really explaining a lot of the challenges and opportunities for the current administration, actually.
Right.
One big factor that has been observed in the past election was the role of local government units, subnational agencies. And then we saw how they are actually islands of good governance. These are opportunities actually that civil society organizations like SIPE and all our other partners in the Philippines have observed are like glimmers of hope despite a very complicated administration. I will just describe it that way. How do you think their role will be moving forward? I mean, having said that they will be like islands of good governance or glimmers of hope in terms of championing democratic values and norms, and including, of course, fighting corruption and promoting transparency and accountability. So what do you make of the role of, it's a long question, but what do you make of the role of local government units, particularly, I guess, just on sustainability agenda, which is, you mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are still in the middle of the pandemic. But in this context, what do you make of the role of local government units moving forward?
Yes, that's a very good question, Bea, because Jenny was asking me about government effectiveness, and I said that the government was able, especially the previous government, was able to show or to frame its effectiveness through through good public image campaigns, and even in addressing the pandemic. Although the data showed that in the initial period of addressing the pandemic, the national government really faced a lot of problems. And because of the ineffectiveness of the government in handling the pandemic, it was an opportunity for what you mentioned, Bea, as the islands of hope provided by good local chief executives. Because, Jenny, you would notice that it was a period of time when people were looking for channels of hope. And we had these very good mayors that came into the picture. In fact, one of them, became a candidate for president, Manila Mayor Isko Moreno. But of course, there are a lot of good mayors, but they should not remain as islands. And they are islands of hope, but there are also islands of despair. We have a lot of local government units. I think the critical challenge is to network all these reform-minded local executives and actually to emphasize the value of policy integration. Because what the local government code, the 1991 local government code provided was autonomy, but at the same time, it calls for effective public service. But one of the challenges really here is that a lot of local governments operate autonomously without considering long-term development plans. So they do projects without consideration for long-term outcomes. That's why it's very important to really network all these local government innovations and to align itself as well with the Philippine Development Plan. Because under the Philippine Development Plan, and I'm referring to the planning tool or planning document of the National Economic and Development Authority, that is where you have the sustainable development goals that are integrated in tandem with the what we call the Ambisyon Natin 2040, which is also a long-term vision of what Filipinos would like to achieve. And this ambition is really ambition, is very much aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that is the proper framing of what Bea calls the islands of hope, because the islands of hope provided by local government units, by innovative and excellent local government units, because not all local government units are excellent and not all of them are really aligning with the future orientation. So I think that's a very good way of advocating for sustainability, being able to partner with the good local governments, and hopefully this would provide models for the rest of the country, and in fact even influence leaders at the very top. So what we need are champions, the subnational level and also at the national level. I think that is the challenge for democratic governance and advocacy.
Yeah, I guess on that note, on that sort of note of optimism, looking for champions, we will unfortunately come to the end of our podcast. The time went so quickly. Dr. Magno, we'll have to have you back again.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. I hope all of our listeners can take a look at the new book, Beyond Crisis, A Strategic Agenda for the Next President, in which Dr. Magno has a chapter. Dr. Magno, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything in the last few seconds, minutes that you want to leave our listeners with?
So I want to leave to our listeners that while these are challenging times for the Philippines, we are facing economic crisis, there's inflation, there is a debt crisis, debt problems. There is also cause for optimism because we have new leaders, that what Bea calls leaders from local governments. And also we have to look at as Jenny mentioned a while ago, the role of the youth. And the emerging youth, young leaders are looking for anchors. And I would say that the Sustainable Development Goals would be one of the key anchors. But it's very important for the citizens of the country, for Filipinos to embrace again the important role of democratic institutions, the role of independent media, the role of knowledge institutions, the role of universities in providing critical analysis, as well as civil society organizations and policy think tanks as information intermediaries. And we need to trust data and use data for democratic governance and for the good of the country.
Definitely. Very wise words and hopeful words for Philippines democracy, as well as democracies globally that are struggling in this time. Thank you very much, Dr. Magno, for joining us today. Thank you, Bea, for being a great co-host again. And a special thanks to Kendall and the comms team for producing this special site mini-series looking at what's at stake for democracy in the Philippines elections. And thanks to our listeners. I hope you'll join us again soon.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit cipe.org.